Hey, Grae. So you had asked me this question, right? What was cool about art history? So I want to give you an answer here and also illustrate it. I'd say that what I think is cool about art history is the way that there's never isolated. In history, I think this is really about history in general, not necessarily only art history. But you can't talk about a historical fact or occurrence without mentioning a whole bunch of other stories. For example, Napoleon invaded whatever. You can't really understand that invasion, what happened there, unless you understand all sorts of stories, the things that were happening around that, these and how interconnected everything is. And I want to illustrate that with the history of photography. The history of photography is a story of many things. It's a story about how photography acquired legitimacy as an artistic medium, which it didn't have in the beginning, quite the contrary. At the same time, it's a story about lots of other things. It's a story about portraiture. It's a story about drawing tools, about paintings, and the thing that ultimately changed photography, something you might not expect to play that type of role. Okay, so have a look at this picture. This is a scene from the window of the photographer's apartment, looking out over the rooftops. This is the first photograph ever made. It was made in 1826, the official start of photography. Our story starts a little bit before the invention of photography, at a time when people were looking for ways of making it easier to draw the likeness of someone more efficiently, faster, because sitting down for a portrait is something that took hours on end, and they were looking for better ways of doing it. And you can see some of the contraptions they came up with. This guy here is using what's called a camera oscura, which is a dark room, translated literally. And you can do this in your room, actually, if you block out all the light coming into your room, except for maybe put a cardboard on the window with a piece of cardboard with a hole in it, no wider than the shaft of a small screwdriver should do it. And what it'll do is it'll project the scene outside of your window upside down on the opposite wall. And that's what this guy's doing here. He's tracing that. So people were looking for ways, of representing the visual world around them. And when photography was invented, it was immediately used as a way of making portraits much more quickly, because you didn't have to sit through a portrait for hours and hours on end. And it wasn't as expensive. It was fast. Suddenly portraits became much more commonplace. The other thing photography was used for was to document the Civil War. But it was in this effort of coming up with a tool that could represent the physical world more efficiently that photography was born. So it wasn't seen as an artistic medium at that time. In fact, people who suggested it were heavily ridiculed by some of the big, most important critics of the time, like Charles Baudelaire here, who had a lot to say on the subject. So what did photographers do? The photographers who wanted to use photography as an artistic medium, they began to imitate the most widely accepted artistic medium of the time, which was painting. So you started to see photographs imitating the subjects of paintings. Some of them are really contrived, like this scene here of a woman dying and the man probably desolate. It's a very contrived, staged scene, as you would put together for a painting, for example. One thing I wanted you to notice in this particular photograph that I'm going to mention later is that all of the subjects, all of the people are entirely contained in the image. Granted, the woman's dress is chopped off a little bit on the right side there, but for the most part, she's entirely in the image. So that's what photographers were doing. They were imitating paintings. So photography is, it's trying to find a way to become an artistic medium, but it's so far standing on the shoulders of painting. That was about to change, and the catalyst was going to be the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution had started already decades earlier, but it was around the turn of the century, 1900s. The Industrial Revolution was now noticeably present in the landscape. We started to see things with their guts exposed. For example, factories. Look at all the tubes and the smokestacks. No attempt is made to hide how the factory works. This type of thing is becoming more prevalent in the environment. Look at this locomotive. There's no attempt to hide the wheels or hide how it works. The piston, you can see everything is right there in front of you. The pistons, how they move back and forth, and how they make the wheel turn. And all of this was new in our environment. The exposure of the entrails, the guts of things, so that it allowed you to see how something worked. Not only that it was working, but how it was working. And you started to see this influence appear in art. For example, architecture. Have a look at this building. The beams and the engineering part of the building, what is holding the building up, is all exposed. It's out in the open. In fact, it's celebrated. One of the more famous examples of this, of course, is the Eiffel Tower. You can see the engineering. So it was as if the architecture was celebrating the characteristics behind the way the building was made. And that influence reached photography. And it was that aspect of the Industrial Revolution that would change photography forever and give it its own legs to stand on. Photographers like Ansel Adams and others, a number of photographers of that time, but especially Ansel Adams, created images that celebrated the medium, that did not try to hide the fact that it was a photograph. This photograph here is one of the most important ones in that process, because it was the first photograph that Ansel Adams was able to make where it was what he had visualized. In other words, he looked like a painter does. He looks at a scene and then interprets that in a certain way and paints it that way. He was able to look at the scene and visualize what he wanted on the end photograph, where he wanted it to be dark, where he wanted it to be light, all of that, and he made it happen. And his images actually were so spectacular that Ansel Adams played a huge role in the establishment of national parks. When there was resistance in Washington to making national parks, he showed up with his extraordinary photographs. Ansel Adams had this big ass camera. It made negatives of 8 by 10 inches. And he used to drive around in his truck car thing here, and he had this platform on top, and he shot amazing images of Yosemite. And he showed that photography, used as photography, when you don't hide the fact that it's a photograph, that's when it stands on its own. And it was very difficult to say that his images were not art. I mean, the feelings that they evoked, the emotions that they evoked, the sense of beauty in them, and all possible exactly because of the fact that it was a photograph. This is something that painting could not do. Painting could not take an image that is exactly taken from the reality and interpreting it and showing that, and having that image show an aesthetic that is there for your eyes to see if you want, is what photography was seeming to say. Now, this isn't the end of the story for us. There's another chapter, and then it really comes full circle. Remember how we started this with photography imitating painting? Well, look at this painting here. This painting is obviously inspired by photography. This is not a scene that you would have seen that you saw in a painting before photography became established as a legitimate artistic medium. Remember the image, that contrived and staged image of the woman dying that I asked you to notice that everybody was, all of the subjects were entirely contained in the image? First of all, look at the guy on the right side. He's half in, half out of the frame. That's very typical of a photograph that is a snapshot of a certain moment. The other thing is, if you look at the man and the woman, they're looking outside of the frame. So there's a lot of indicators that there are things of interest going on outside the frame. There are people coming up from the side there that are entering the frame. These two here, and the man and the woman, are looking beyond the outside of the frame. There's something that's caught their interest there. This is influence from photography, that this instant that is captured randomly is the type of thing photography did. Here's another one. A moment captured in time and in movement. The guy is rowing the boat and snap. There's a image captured there of that moment.